Thank you and good morning. Welcome to Investing Amid Regulatory Uncertainty. This morning, our goal is to give you a practical, hands-on approach to the risk that startups and their investors face in this heavily regulated environment. What we would like to do is provide a step-by-step process that founders and their investors can use to understand, evaluate, and quantify the risks that their companies face and in their industries. We're going to give you an overview as well of the current risk to provide a baseline. I'm Jeff Englander. I'm the founder and principal of the Healthcare Strategy Bullpen. We're health tech consultants that bridge the disconnect between healthcare and technology. We help healthcare startups scale. We run targeted pilots and teach them how to strategically prospect. I'm joined by Ralph Hall. Ralph is a principal in the Washington, D.C. office of Levitt Partners. Ralph provides consulting services to clients in the area of FDA statutes and regulations, regulatory compliance, healthcare policy and legislation, and Ralph has a rich background with drug and medical device regulation and corporate compliance. Prior to Levitt, Ralph was a counsel at Farge Baker Daniels. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Ralph. Where he provided legal services, including FDA-related matters and corporate compliance. Prior to that, Ralph was general counsel for Guidant CRM and was chief compliance officer for Guidant, and he will provide some insight in what it's like to dealing with the FDA and regulators as a company. We're also joined by Paul Heldman. Paul specializes in translating legislative developments and policy changes for government health insurance programs, the FDA, pharmaceuticals, US health spending, healthcare legislation, and national elections for the investment community. Paul is a managing partner at Heldman Simpson Partners. Prior to Heldman Simpson, Paul ran the healthcare team at Potomac Research Group, where during his 7 years there, he focused primarily on health services and drug reimbursement issues for institutional investors. Thank you both for joining us. So let's set the stage in terms of investing amid regulatory uncertainty. And let's first talk about definitions and types of risks. So the risks we're going to try to talk about here are stroke of the pen, or what I refer to as legislative risk, socioeconomic and political risk, and the difference between the two. Political risk to me is legislative risk, risk of an executive order. Socioeconomic risk is really the risk of something like a pandemic or the social disturbances we've had in terms of Black Lives Matter and other issues about disparities being recognized. There's technological risk, and there's also subsector or specific company risks. So Paul, I think you're one of the best I know at this in terms of creating a framework for looking at this on a consistent basis. Can you give us a general overview of where things related to healthcare typically start in Congress and how they typically move through Congress, and what you would look at if you were an emerging company to monitor them?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Jeff. It's great to be with you and Ralph and with everybody at the conference. I guess I would start out with sort of larger premises about watching legislation, which is that more often than not, large healthcare initiatives fail. And if they do move, it usually takes a few years for some sort of consensus to build up and outside forces to sort of align in a way, and the internal forces to align in a way that it works politically for legislation to become law. So if you think about creating a Medicare drug benefit. It took several years to get to that day in December 2003 when President Bush signed it in law. If you think about the Obama health law, you're really thinking back to, I mean, you could all go all the way back to Harry Truman, but you could argue that that basically the failed Clinton effort in 1994, it took many years to get to the point where you're able to pass something where the government played a much greater role in financing healthcare and regulating healthcare to try to get more people into the system. And so here we are with the drug pricing debate, and it's been years under discussion about whether or not the government should have greater authority and control over drug prices. And so we sort of start out with the premise that most likely the most ambitious parts of the Democratic agenda on drug prices are most likely to fail. But there are pressures building. There are budget pressures building, and that's part of what I think will ultimately drive whether we get drug legislation into law this year. The other thing to recognize is that most often, even in a year when you are going to get major legislation, it usually takes much of the year for it to become law. And so, as I just mentioned, with the Medicare drug benefit, it took till December of 2003 for the legislation to become law, even though they had been discussing it for much of the year, and it started to come together in May of that year. And then with the Obama health law, the discussions really started for all intents and purposes with his budget in late February or March of his first year in office, but it took another year to get it over the finish line. So I suspect whatever's being discussed, whatever's been proposed on drug prices, at the earliest that we'll really see that there'll be any chance of something becoming law, and we'll have an idea of what it might be, will be in the fourth quarter and probably late in the year. The other thing to know about Congress is that there's really only thing that Congress has to do, one thing that Congress has to do every year. They have to pass a dozen bills, which are usually packaged into one, to fund the government, the operating budgets of domestic agencies and the Defense Department for the following fiscal year. And so frequently what happens is that comes down to the end of the year, and then associated with that, they have to from time to time raise the government's borrowing limit, and they're going to have to do that again this year to ensure that they don't default on their debt. And the government never has, and I don't expect they ever will, or at least I don't expect them to do it this year. And so usually what happens with that is you get something that I think Jeff referred to as an omnibus bill at the end of the year that other stuff gets attached to. So every lobbyist, whether they're lobbying for consumers or for segments of industry, knows that that legislation has got to become law. It's likely to become law, and they try to get their provisions attached to that. And so that's another reason why you get a lot of legislative activity at the end of the year. And then I'll just finish with, you mentioned pandemics. Congress also does act during a crisis. And I think President Biden felt there was a need for a couple $1 trillion in additional spending related to the pandemic early on, and he was able to do that earlier in the year. And as part of that, that was another way to move forward on legislation. In this particular case, and probably good for the healthcare sector, he added, at least temporarily, a lot of funding for financing the health benefits of people of the near poor in this country, and added maybe 1 million people to the insurance rolls so far.
Great. You talked about the omnibus legislation, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But can you, just for some of the uninformed, talk about, where does healthcare legislation typically start? In the Senate, usually health, education, labor. And if you're looking to follow these things early on, kind of what committees do you look to?
Right.
And then, what are the kind of government publication requirements and committee hearings they have to have, and where would you follow these things because these companies are constantly dealing with an uncertain regulatory environment. So even if we have a good sense, and we'll talk about this at the very end, about where we think things are right now, a year from now, it'll be totally different. So you want to develop a methodology for following the legislative outlook.
Right. Well, I think that one thing that we've seen under the Biden administration, certainly with Republicans and Democrats in Congress over the last 6 years, is a commitment to spending a lot more money on basic biomedical research. And Biden sort of wants to expand that further than the National Institutes of Health already has, into creating some sort of bridge to the basic research to the full, to actually taking the basic research and making it into a treatment or a cure or a diagnostic, by creating a whole new institute within NIH. And so one thing that I'm watching now, and I spent the week watching, were the subcommittee hearings on this. So there are appropriations committees that are just charged with putting together the legislation that funds the daily operations of government in the next fiscal year. And the most important one is the Appropriations Committee that deals with the Department of Health and Human Services and for NIH, and particularly NIH. And so the players there in the House are the committee chairwoman Rosa DeLauro. Her counterpart on the subcommittee is Tom Cole, Republican from Oklahoma, very supportive of NIH funding. And on the Senate side, at the subcommittee level, you have Patty Murray from Washington. On the Democratic side, she's chairwoman of the subcommittee, and Roy Blunt, a Republican from Missouri. So my view, watching them over the last week, is they're very supportive in broad terms of this new additional agency, which would be modeled on the Defense Department's DARPA, which was instrumental in the creation of the internet, and that was sort of described as being able to work with small businesses. So I may be very suitable for your audience, to help bring the most promising basic biomedical research to develop it and bring it into clinical trials for the market. And so I think the debate right now is whether the $6.5 billion that they're supposed to get, and the NIH budget is about $43 billion. Should that all go to this new institute, or should more of it go to basic research? But as Representative Cole, a Republican, said, he was on board with the overall funding increase from Biden, which is about 19% above current funding. So I'm watching that very closely. I watched those hearings this week. I came away feeling like, yes, there is a potential that there's a stalemate and there is no government funding across the board, including for NIH next year, is flat. But I think this is still more likely he's to get at least half of what he wants, and this new institute will be created. And the other players to watch in that are Congressman Fred Upton. He's from Michigan. He's a Republican from Michigan, used to chair the House Energy and Commerce Committee, but he was term limited. And Diana DeGette of Colorado. They worked on legislation that really is designed for healthcare entrepreneurs. It was called the Cures legislation late in 2016. It was to try to find ways to accelerate FDA consideration of new products, and to really help push along digital health initiatives. They're working on the next round of legislation. And Upton has already said he's very interested in this Biden NIH initiative. So that's potentially another vehicle. And we're watching for the second draft of Cures legislation and for the movement of that. There are a few other key committees on healthcare that we're watching, and I know we got to get to other things, but I would just say, watch the Senate Finance Committee. They're responsible for Medicare and Medicaid taxes. That's where drug legislation will come out of. Patty Murray chairs another health committee, the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. They have some responsibility for healthcare and also specifically for FDA and public health issues. And then on the House side, you have the House Energy and Commerce Committee, chaired by Frank Pallone, and the House Ways and Means Committee, chaired by Richie Neal. They both share responsibility for Medicare, and Energy and Commerce for Medicaid, and the Energy Ways and Means Committee has tax jurisdiction. So those committees are traditionally involved in the much bigger healthcare issues, and they will be involved in drug pricing issues.
Great, thank you very much. So Ralph, that's your cue. So once these rules become law, how does it become regulation? And can you talk about the role of the FDA versus the role of CMS? And, give us a little or a few insights from your experience as a GC on dealing with regulators and ways to deal with regulators, and perhaps a couple things not to do.
I'll be glad to. And first, let me join Paul and Jeff in welcoming you. And we do appreciate this opportunity. So Congress necessarily paints with a very broad brush. And while the laws seem complicated and very detailed, they end up requiring the agencies, whether it's CMS, FDA, those are the two primary ones we'll talk about, to really turn those into operational sets of rules, requirements, processes, and procedures. And think of this as a pyramid. At the top, you've got the statute, right? There are fewer of them. They're much broader. Then you go to regulation. Regulation goes through a formal process. It takes 5 to 7 years to get a new regulation through the system, assuming it gets through it all. And so we have about 900 pages of statute in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. We've got about 5,000 pages of regs just on the FDA side in the Code of Federal Regulations. And it literally takes 5 to 7 years. It's almost an act of Congress to get a regulation through. Now, regulations are binding. They're binding on the agency. They're binding on the regulated community. Below that, at the next layer down in the pyramid, you have guidance documents. These are technically not binding. They have a lot of draft guidances. And we joke in my world that nothing is more binding than a draft guidance. All right. And yes, I can tell, I also teach at a law school, okay? And technically they're not binding, but the agency thinks they are. All right. And those will take 3 or 4 years to get through. So we don't move very fast once Congress passes something. Those go through a notice and comment process as well. So FDA will come out with a draft guidance document on a particular topic. They just came out with a new one yesterday on some post-market surveillance issues. That goes through a notice and comment process. Any of you can send in comments. By the way, I strongly recommend that you engage in this process. This is your chance to start to write the rules or to influence the rules that you'll live by. So you have those guidance documents, and there are thousands of them out there. FDA has a website. The guidances are available on the website. I hope FDA isn't listening. It's not a very good website, okay? It's really hard to find things sometimes. And FDA off the record will also admit that. But they're out there, and you've got to know those. That's what your reviewer will look at. Much more, they rarely look at the statute. One of the challenges we have is making sure FDA staff actually know the statute and follow it. There's a concept in the statute called least burdensome on the device side, in which the regs, the guidances, the individual product actions are supposed to take the least burdensome approach to achieving the regulatory objective. So that's out there, and no one quite knows what that means, but that is out there. So you got these guidance documents. Then you have their internal processes and procedures. You'll hear people talk about the MAP, M-A-P-P, Manual of Agency Policies and Practices. It's how they do their day-to-day job. Okay, and that's publicly available. Understanding that is very important. Now, understand also, so let me back up. FDA handles products. Basically, It's a physical item. You drop it, it goes clunk, whether it's a drug, whether it's a device. Software and artificial intelligence, all of that, it creates great challenges for the agency. We can talk about that if people want to. I'm actually working with FDA on some artificial intelligence matters right now. But they deal with the product. FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine. They deal with, does the product work? Is it safe and effective for its intended use? That is key, intended use. As the company, as the sponsor of the product, you define the intended use. And all of your clinical data, your performance data, et cetera, is to support that your product is safe and effective for that intended use. Okay, so be very careful in writing your intended use. Now, you're only supposed to market within the parameters of that intended use. That's a very complicated topic. Off-label promotion has a bunch of fascinating First Amendment issues. If somebody really wants to be a nerd like me, we can spend hours talking about it, okay? But you're supposed to market within your intended use. You need to understand the psychology or the environment of the agencies. FDA does products. By statute, they're not supposed to care what something costs. So when you say, oh, this is cheaper, well, formally, they're supposed to ignore that. Informally, they pay attention to it. CMS, they are the coverage and payment people, but only for federal health care. Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, you know, all of those things. And understand coverage and reimbursement are a little bit different. Is this particular procedure, product, whatever, is it covered? Is this something that's, quote, reasonable and necessary to treat whatever the disease is, et cetera? That's the legal standard. Note here, FDA, is the product safe and effective? CMS, is it reasonable and necessary? And by the way, we have never defined reasonable and necessary, but that's
And that just reasonable and necessary just comes from, I believe, the Social Security statute, correct?
it does. You're 100% right, Jeff, which goes back to the early 60s. Okay. Now, once they say we're going to cover it, then reimbursement is how much are we going to pay for it? You need to understand how all these pieces work. Now, I recognize that all of these agencies are all part of Health and Human Services, and theoretically, they all work together very well, right? That's theory. They really are very separate silos. Maybe at the very top, there's some discussion, but they're very separate silos. All right. Now, also now understand the psychology and the mindset of the people within the agencies. FDA has about 18,000 employees, contractors, et cetera, right? There are less than 7 political appointees, so-called politicos at FDA. And the other 17,993 are career civil servants. Their administrations come and go, they're still there. A couple of years ago, I was talking to somebody who had just retired from FDA, and he said, you know, Ralph, we really don't care what the new commissioner says or doesn't say. We outlast them. Okay. And also understand the environment of the agency. If you want to assess the culture and the key factors of an organization, tell me who the heroes are. Not the formal heroes, but the actual heroes. If I know who the heroes are and why they're the heroes, I can tell you the environment. And who is the biggest hero at FDA? The only FDA person ever to get the Congressional Medal of Freedom, a woman named Dr. Frances Kelsey. She kept thalidomide off the market. Those of you of my age remember thalidomide, okay? She did it by not approving it. The heroes are people that didn't approve. If you're at FDA, the risk is if you approve a product and there's a problem, you know, you're on the line. So the approval of a product is a risk if you're the FDA reviewer. And it's hard to get in trouble by asking more questions, right? They also are civil servants. So understand that kind of dynamic. So how do you deal with this? Understand these differences. Understand that Congress has limited actual impact on things. I don't want to downplay that, but these people operate within their sets of rules. I'm a firm believer in regulatory strategy, an integrated upfront strategy that links your FDA regulatory, your reimbursement coverage, and it's not just CMS, it's private payers as well.
Right.
Right? It's linking into who your customers are, the professional societies. Who's going to be buying your product? What's your market? How does it fit in with competitors? And I strongly urge people to do that up front. So you have that integrated strategy. So when you're talking to FDA, you know they want you to change your intended use statement. Is that a big deal or is it irrelevant? Well, how does it affect coverage? How does it affect how the professional societies view it? How does it affect, how consumers, patients will view the product? I'll do a little diversion here. FDA is not your enemy, okay? They have a job to do. It's a very important job. Compliance can be a competitive advantage. If I can get through FDA faster, better, cheaper, that is a tremendous competitive advantage.
And that's why, and pardon me for interrupting, Ralph, and we're going to talk about this in next panel, so I get a free cue about common mistakes startups make, but that's why you recommend having a regulatory policy up front, so you get out quicker and you get that competitive advantage.
Exactly. And if I've got an integrated strategy, the clinical trial I do to get my product approved then fits into the clinical data I need to get CMS coverage and a good reimbursement. Okay, I don't want to have to run one clinical trial for FDA, spend all that time and money, and then go, oh, whoops, I now need to do a second clinical study for CMS. I want to do that all in one study, if at all possible. And that's that integrated strategy. Don't forget international either. I know we're focusing here on US, but many of our products have a global use. And again, it's having that integrated strategy. I go to Europe first, get the clinical data there, come back. How does FDA view international data? All of those kinds of things. The other thing, and then I'll be quiet and you can move on, to recognize that you're going to the agency, whether it's CMS, FDA, with a single product, with a single objective. I want my product approved. FDA looks at that not only with that product lens, but they also look at it as how it fits into the broad portfolio that they're dealing with. Are they setting precedent? They have to treat people the same. If they do something for you, they've got to do it for other people. All right. And often the barriers you feel have nothing to do with your particular product. It has to do with how that decision or whatever fits into that broader portfolio that they have to deal with. Okay. So you need to understand what their triggers are. What are their issues? As part of that, there's something I call regulatory drift. I can read the statute, the regs, the guidances. They were interpreted one way under the Trump administration. They're being looked at a different way under the Biden administration, even though the words are identical. Okay? So you have to understand this drift. And that can be because of politics. It can be because of external events. I work on diagnostic test legislation. When we go into a congressional office, what's one of the first questions we get? Would this have prevented Theranos? Right? And all those external events impact how the agencies look at things. This is this regulatory drift. This is the environment that you have to be aware of. The last point I'll make is that if you're frustrated, one of the riskier things you can do is to go to Congress and ask them to intervene with FDA. Okay, I strongly advise to think long and hard before that. That gets the Congress people, the members of Congress in trouble. It irritates FDA. And so it's easy to see CEOs say, we'll go to, I'll go to my senator. Be very careful with that. All right, let me let you move on.
That was very helpful, Ralph, and I'll follow up with a question after we cue Paul for a couple of his tidbits. So, Paul, you mentioned Patty Murray and Fred Upton and a couple of other people. Can you talk about, and you also talked about the health, education, and finance and judiciary and a couple of the other committees. Can you talk about some of the interest groups that you, in particular, you would pay attention to? I mean, obviously we hear about, pharma and the generic drug manufacturers and others anytime there's drug pricing legislation. But, who do you think holds the power, on the Hill? Where do you, pay a great deal of attention? You mentioned Frank Pallone from New Jersey. I know he has a good reputation and good relationship with AHIP and the insurance companies. How do you kind of follow that, and who do you kind of follow as the power players?
So when I'm thinking about drug price legislation, which I look most closely, if I had to pick from the sort of boil it down from the dozen or so players, top key players involved, I'm watching very closely the Senate Finance Committee, because they, to the degree that there are more moderate members of the Democratic Party, that they have some of them. And Ron Wyden, the chairman of the committee, has been willing to work across party lines to try to get drug price legislation done. And he's worked with Senator Grassley, the former chairman of the committee, on drug price legislation, which it looks like pharma at least might be willing to accept. It basically, for the synopsis of it, is it basically caps Medicare drug price growth at the consumer price index, and reorganizes the Medicare Part D retail drug benefit, the catastrophic portion of it, so that instead of taxpayers covering 80% of the cost of it, and insurers just 15%, and the beneficiaries 5%, the beneficiaries' costs would be eliminated. Insurers would pay significantly more, and drug makers would pay more, help finance it by providing discounts. And so that's the key committee. And then on that committee, I mean, one of the key players is Senator Robert Menendez, because he's from New Jersey, and he is much more sensitive to the industry's interests as a major employer in New Jersey. Pallone's from New Jersey is too, but as you point out, he is closer, as you argue, closer to the insurance industry maybe, and is much more aggressive on drug pricing. So how you have a 50-50 Senate essentially, with the vice president breaking the tie. You have an evenly split finance committee. Menendez's role in sort of determining what he's going to allow to go through the finance committee or even through Congress is important. And then through the larger Senate, the more moderate members like Joe Manchin of West Virginia, and John Tester of Montana, and Kristen Sinema of Arizona, they are key players in terms of deciding what they're going to allow the Democrats to do on drug pricing and other health care legislation, including creating another government-run health insurance alternative, which if you're an entrepreneur, you have to be thinking about, because while I don't think that that's likely, the fact that it's under discussion, the whole idea is to give the government new pricing power that would presumably put a lot of pressure on reimbursement on hospitals and doctors, and secondarily on product prices. So those are the players that I'm looking at most closely. I would just mention one other thing, because I know you wanted to touch on this, Jeff. I mean, outside of that, You mentioned interest groups. I mean, there are a bunch of government watchdog agencies that come up with many of the ideas that Congress adopts in healthcare, especially when they want to save money. So, for example, the Trump administration in 2018 sharply reduced Medicare reimbursement to hospitals for specialty drugs covered under the Part B, physician administered portion, part of the program. That's fast growing program, $40 billion a year, has been growing 10% a year. It's where a lot of biotech and cancer drugs are covered. And basically there are 2,000 hospitals that qualify for deep discounts under a program called 340B. The Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, which is an advisory panel to Congress that puts out recommendations to Congress twice a year, recommended that those Medicare reimbursement to those providers be cut significantly in 2016, and the Trump administration actually carried it out in 2018. They were sued and they've prevailed so far. So you definitely have to watch groups like the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, which is an investigative arm of Congress. And for regulatory purposes in terms of compliance, as Ralph mentioned, and also in terms of areas where the watchdogs think the government might be overpaying on their health insurance programs, the Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services, and they all have sort of compendium of their recommendations on their websites. So it's easy to look at what it is they're thinking about. But you also want to look at interest groups like where Biden draws his people from, like the Center for American Progress, or if you're actually trying to bring a product to market, you might want to look at and engage with the physician specialty societies that might be have, you know, whose members your product will
Like something
ultimately
like the
appeal to.
American College of Cardiology, or, you know, ASCO.
Exactly.
That's great. That's great advice. And for those of you, you know, even before COVID, MedPAC, which meets, I believe, at least twice a year, those hearings are available online. The full text of their recommendations is put out if anybody wants a nice, comfortable 500-page read. The latest one, I'm happy to send it to you. If for those of you who weren't following too closely, that is where MedPAC recommended that a lot of the relaxation of rules and enforcement for telehealth and digital health was, they recommended further study for about 2 years because they weren't convinced that telehealth was creating the savings and efficiencies that they were expecting. And there was a recent GAO report kind of questioning the same thing. Please feel to reach out to me if you'd like to get a copy of that. So Ralph, you mentioned it briefly before, and I do want to get a little bit more on the current regulatory outlook, but I know we've talked a lot about it. But can you talk about kind of the tension, if you will, or the struggle between HHS, which is a lot of political appointees, and it was demonstrated, you know, under Secretary Azar, versus the career, you know, professionals at the FDA. And, you know, I know one of the things that Scott Gottlieb has said is that, you know, one of his roles as the FDA commissioner was to kind of go to bat for the career professionals and push back against some of the political pressure. So can you talk about that tension a little bit and how it manifests itself? Sure,
it's an important question. Recognize the commissioner has a very difficult job for any number of reasons. Obviously, the commissioner has to run an organization of 18,000 people. He or she is expected to be their advocate. FDA is part of HHS and reports up to the secretary. And so the political pressure, and I don't mean that in the negative sense, but the political imperatives, the political directives come top down. So they go White House, Congress, whomever, to HHS. HHS may originate them, from there to FDA. The commissioner has to, and then the center directors, interpret those, try to implement them if appropriate, et cetera. And this is where the center directors become important. And I want to build on a couple things Paul said. Then we'll get to the specifics of the HHS under Trump and FDA and what that means today. You need to understand the people and who influences them. Center directors or the commissioner, right now it's acting Commissioner Woodcock. She wants to be commissioner. That's going to influence her decision making. Okay. The deeming rule recently in tobacco, that was part of this broader political. You've got a brand new center director at the Center for Drugs, Patrizia Cavazzoni. Okay, she's new in the job. She's trying to establish her bona fides. You've got Jeff Shuren at the Device Center, right? Longest serving center director. He's got his agenda. Peter Mark, head of the biologics. He has COVID vaccines. All of these people are dealing with HHS. For the first 3 years of the Trump administration, that seems to be that was a very good working relationship. Scott Gottlieb was masterful, in my opinion, at navigating all of that. And he didn't have COVID. COVID hits, you've got a new commissioner, and the relationship really deteriorates. And there were literally shouting matches. And there were a number of HHS directives that ended up just getting implemented without even FDA knowledge, input, et cetera. So there was a breakdown, in my opinion, between senior leaders at HHS and FDA. And a number of things got through that FDA career people hated. One of the things we've seen in the first several months of the Biden administration is really kind of two major themes for this purpose. One, trying to rebuild that relationship. And it's important that they work together, okay? And I think Gottlieb in the first 3 years of the Trump administration was masterful at it. HHS now is deliberately trying to rebuild that, so is FDA. You also see an ongoing effort to unwind a number of the initiatives or decisions made by the prior administration in the last year. So these are coming out, periodically, where particular rules get pulled, particular decisions or positions get withdrawn. You've seen this with LDTs, you've seen lab developed tests, you've seen this with some down classifications of devices. We see this right now with the MCIT, Medicare coverage for innovative technology, that was put in place. They reopened the comment period. They've now extended that comment period to December 15th, I think is the date for that. So you see this unwinding, this backing away from a number of those pronouncements, while you see this effort to kind of rebuild that, that very important relationship. There's also important relationships with the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. I mentioned one of the reasons it takes so long for regs and guidances to get through is they've got to all go through OMB. At least most guidances do. There's some exceptions not relevant here. So the relationship at these top levels to these other agencies are really important in terms of timing, in terms of substance. And we're seeing this concerted effort to rebuild that. And FDA is working with HHS to get the retraction of a number of those initiatives, whether you agree with them or disagree with them is a different issue, to kind of pull those back, and some to rethink, some just to get rid of.
That's very helpful. So what I'd like to do now is, if anyone in the audience does have a question, please do submit it via the Q&A function on Zoom. For those who haven't done that before, if you go down the bottom and put your cursor.
Hey, Jeff, actually, they can use it through Slido as they're watching right on the right side. Yep.
Sorry, Christina. Okay, and if you want to put those to Slido, and I guess Christina will get those to me.
Yeah.
But we'll have one more quick question while you folks are doing that, and I do encourage you to ask questions. So we did talk about the current regulatory outlook. We've talked about drug placing legislation, and we've talked a little bit about the omnibus legislation. Can you talk, Paul and Ralph, and I'll go to Ralph first, and you get about a minute or so here, depending on how many questions we get. What do people need to look at in terms of evaluating where they may go to pay for some of these things in the omnibus legislation, and what may get cut, what may get money, and how do you evaluate that and keep an eye on that?
So we're expecting the president's budget packet out any day now. I've heard maybe it comes out tomorrow. I'm going to tell you a reason why that's very important. I'm also going to tell you a reason why it may not be as important. So I'm going to give you kind of both sides.
I thought you were a lawyer, not an economist.
Tell me the answer you want, we'll get you there, right? The budget is obviously very important. It signals the administration's priorities, where they want to put money, et cetera. Okay, so you need to look at it carefully for those purposes. But it's a budget. Nothing happens till Congress actually appropriates the money. So to say, oh, the president budgeted, $1 billion for X, in a sense, that's a political or a policy statement. It's then, does Congress actually appropriate $1 billion, $1 million, or nothing, right? And that's where kind of the rubber hits the road. So this is why it's very important to look at, to understand policy, but don't overread it to say that money is actually going to be appropriated and spent. Make sense?
Yes, that's very helpful. Paul, your thoughts on where to look in terms of it's, because it tends to be like a balloon a little bit. There's not a lot of extra pay for it. So if you want to give someone money, you've got to take it from somebody else. Where do you tend to look?
Right. So we know that that President Biden wants to increase corporate taxes and increase the taxes on capital gains and other taxes on the wealthy. And we know now, because of what some key lawmakers, such as Senator Manchin of West Virginia, have said, that he's not going to get everything he wants, certainly on taxes, on tax increases. So to the degree that they want to pay for legislation, and they don't pay for everything they do, that's why we have budget deficits that are bigger than the U.S. economy. When I look at healthcare, I look at areas that have sort of been discussed by Democrats before, including Medicare Advantage managed care, which now accounts for about 40% of the enrollment in the Medicare program. And in the post-acute provider space, where the Medicare Payment Advisory Commissions, which we've discussed, has said, that their Medicare pre-tax profit margins are largely above 10% a year. And by Washington standards, for post-acute providers, that's way too high. And there is been discussion for years, and I think some agreement that there need to be broader reforms to how Medicare pays post-acute providers. There have been some, but trying to find a way to reduce the disparity between what a skilled nursing facility gets paid to help rehab a knee replacement in a Medicare patient versus what an inpatient rehab facility gets paid versus what a home health agency gets paid. So this is something that is probably going to happen. Whether it happens, starts this year or 5 years from now, I mean, I think is the big question. It's eventually going to happen. And what I'm looking for in Biden's budget, which I believe is coming out tomorrow, is whether he introduces any sort of the Medicare savings that it's popped up in the Obama budget or the Trump budgets in the past. As Ralph said, the Congress can completely ignore what the president proposes. So the fact that he's putting out a budget is, as he points out, is a policy statement, but they do play a role in negotiating whatever's going to be in final legislation and how they might pay for some of it. And so to the degree that new Medicare savings proposals pops up, or what pops up in terms of savings, if anything, he may not have anything in there, is pretty important. And both the Trump and Obama budgets had drug savings in there. They had post-acute savings in there. The Obama budget had Medicare Advantage savings in there. So.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you very much. So I wanted to thank everyone for joining us. I'd like to thank Georgia Bio for inviting us. My personal thanks to both Paul Heldman and Ralph Hall for joining us and providing their insights. For those of you who may have missed a portion of this or would like to replay it, the sessions will be recorded. And I will put in a plug for our next session. We will be doing a session in about 5 minutes called Startups, Mistakes and Lessons Learned. And I'd love to have you join us. And thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.